Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the best show of the best shows, where we talk about everything from comic books to even social commentary. This is episode number 2 of For Canon's Sake. So whether you're a normie, a wannabe expert, or a tryhard, get in there. And now, for your host, Mr. Eric July.
Woo! Things are hot on social media right now, specifically Twitter, at least for me. Facebook is hot though too. Things are nuts. People are freaking out. And we're going to discuss all of that today. This is episode 2 of For Canon's Sake. I am your host, Eric D. July. Let me just say, first episode got a lot of love. Looks like this is something that I should have done a long time ago. I kind of knew that. I'm not going to lie to you. I kind of knew that. But you guys for sure solidified that. I appreciate that. Appreciate the support, of course. As always, forcanonsake.com, you can get some more information. And if you do want to support the show, I'm readjusting some of the Patreon rewards for my Patreon to give you guys some rewards. So if you guys want to support the show specifically, go ahead and go over to patreon.com/Eric July, or Eric D. July, excuse me. That's patreon.com/Eric D. July. For one-time donations, you can visit ericdjuly.com. Now, before I get into this and what we're going to be speaking about, we have to at least talk about comics in a sense. Can't have the whole show. I could, and I'm sure there will be some whole shows that are specifically about some of the topics at hand, such as that are like political, maybe apolitical or anti-political sometimes, but you get it. But man, my review is up of Savage Avengers #1. Holy crap. I think this was a no-brainer. I'm so glad it's happening. First issue was sick. We got some clash with Logan, aka Wolverine, as well as Conan the Barbarian, man. And that was crazy. It was really crazy. Artwork solid. Storytelling looks like it's going to be solid. Brother Voodoo is getting some love. For those that don't know, he is one of my more favorite characters. I think he's been around for a long time. There's no I think about that, but I do think that Marvel has been sleeping on the character. He showed up briefly with in No Road Home, and now he's in Savage Avengers. So I do love the fact that that is a thing. And I encourage them to keep expanding upon this character. Savage Avengers #1, go pick it up. They're not sponsoring me, though. They should. Marvel, hey, Marvel. Hey, if you want to get to the real, you need to holler at your boy. Let me consult. I can help you guys out, especially Marvel Studios. Whatever the hell you guys are doing over there at Marvel Studios, I can for sure help you out. And I'll do it for relatively cheap. You guys' pockets align, you'll be fine. But for sure today, the topic at hand, the topic that we are for sure going to discuss in depth, is this concept of free speech. Free speech is so misunderstood, sadly. A lot of people use it willy-nilly, have no idea what they're talking about, or they just get it completely wrong. Now, there's a couple of different angles that I'm going to take with this. But just for context purposes, what recently happened is Facebook got a little more strict. They've taken some pages down. Milo Yiannopoulos is one. I believe they got Paul Joseph Watson, a.k.a. Prison Planet, and some others. Completely bounced them off the site, as well as Instagram, which I believe Facebook owns now. So people saw that, and obviously there are some big reactions to it because those guys are very influential, for better or worse, but they're very influential and they have a big followings. And it's no secret that there seems to be this lean as far as what sorts of pages get banned. I know Louis Farrakhan was banned as well. if I'm not mistaken. But there's been this slight lean that I'm sure you've seen documented. People make note of it. The fact that, well, it looks like that there's conservatives in the mix way more often than leftists, or mainstream leftists, that tend to get banned. And I will say that it's not exclusively conservatives. Libertarians have been getting bans as well. I don't know if you guys remember, there was this massive purge that Facebook had. Some pretty big pages got taken down as a part of it. And so, of course, there's been this sort of build up to this point, and people are just kind of saying, hey, look, you see, this is what we've been talking about. So I had to set the scene up with that. Now let's talk about free speech and what it actually means. Now, free speech, and this is the angle that's going to throw you guys off. There's no such thing. Now, before you get to tripping, wait a minute, you're wrong. Constitution, pieces of paper, old government documents. That has nothing to do with anything. But I'm going to give you a logical explanation as far as what free speech is and how it really doesn't exist. But if you are going to operate on let's say a logical meaning of it, you're attacking it the wrong way. We'll get into all of that here in a little bit. But let me just explain how there is no such thing, no such concept as free speech. Free speech doesn't exist. You don't have a right to free speech. Now, the same thing can be said about a lot of other things. No, I'm not saying that rights don't exist or anything like that. No, the only rights that exist are private property rights, first starting with self-ownership. That is, you own yourself and therefore your body. Nobody has right to use aggression upon you and so forth. So when you consider rights in that element, it is all rights are negative rights. They do not require the violation of someone else's rights to exist. A lot of people misspeak when they say things like the government grants rights. I hate the term constitutional rights. I hate those terms because what it does is it assumes that these certain rights they come from the government documents, which is why it's always overemphasis on government documents, because people are looking to those to legitimize it. And ironically enough, though I'm an ANCAP libertarian, so I don't really care about the quote unquote founders, if you will, but they don't even agree with you because they recognize that these rights are natural. They're inherited. You just have them existing as a human being. And what people do is misspeak when they say things like, this government is taking their rights away. No. That's not what's happening. Or I know a lot of people like to argue with me about this, and they'll say, well, if you don't think these rights exist, go to so-and-so. Go to this country with this oppressive government or this oppressive atmosphere, volatile atmosphere. And again, that's not what the concept of a right is. The concept of a right, again, exists. It exists regardless. So if a government is oppressing somebody, let's say they said something they said murder was fine, not self-defense, murder, or something like that. Or you have the right to murder certain sorts of individuals, certain types, they say you can. That is not the government taking away your rights. That is the government violating your rights. The rights exist. They predate the government. Doesn't matter. So you can scratch that as well as the nonsense of, well, there are no rights without government and stuff like that. No. They effectively violate the right. So if there's some area that says rape is legal, some crazy like that, that is a violation of the woman's rights, or anybody. I mean, anybody can be raped, or the rights of anybody, because that is a act of aggression, is a violent bodily invasion. So in that context, rights cannot be taken away or given. They exist. What they can be what can be had, they can be acknowledged, obviously, and they can also be violated, but they cannot be taken away or given. So when you look at it in that context, let's talk about free speech. The right to free speech, a lot of people say. And the reason why people are bringing this up is because, well, they will say something like Facebook, say that they're violating people's right to free speech, violating free speech. And if you support this, you don't believe in free speech. Free speech doesn't exist. There's no such thing as a right to free speech. It's another sort of mistalk. You're misspeaking. Because you have to sit back and think, and the great Rothbard has done a great job, Murray Rothbard that is, of sort of spelling this idea out. But when you think about free speech, where does free speech exist? If it's not absolute, then it's not a right. But where does free speech exist? I don't have a right to kick down my neighbor's door or just walk in and let's say he leaves the door open. I'll just walk in there and I start yelling. And he grabs me and throws me out on the yard. Says, get the hell out of my house, yelling. I can't say, well, you're violating my right to free speech because it doesn't exist. That's his property. So the only concept of free speech that ever exists is in a property right. So it doesn't really exist. There's only private property rights. There's no right to free speech. There's only private property rights. That is that on your property, you can say, do whatever you want. And on others, so as long you can say and do whatever boundaries they've set in terms of rules on their property, you obviously must follow those. So it doesn't really exist. And on the internet's case, when we're talking about this, people that own these websites and so forth, servers or what have you, they have a right to kick you off, unfortunately. Now, there are contractual obligations that they should be bound by as well as a user, right? They have these terms of services and stuff like that. And that's a completely different aspect. Again, we'll go over that here in a little bit, but that's something else that I would say you should be focusing on as opposed to saying free speech, because there's no such thing as free speech. Now, in often cases, what people will say, hey, what we mean by free speech is that, you can't be, I don't know, let's say you can't be punished by way of the government because of something that you said. And, that's indeed true. But that's not necessarily free speech, and that's certainly not what you guys are talking about in this regard. When we talk about Facebook or Twitter or these gigantic media corporations banning people from their sites, that is not free speech. That is not an example of free speech. That's not an example of them violating free speech when they ban you. That's not what this is. What this is them on these websites and they're kicking people off. Now, that right in itself exists. Are they violating some sort of term, services and agreements that they have with the end users that they are banning? That's a whole different discussion. But have that discussion. But free speech doesn't exist. But even by way of, let's say, a logical definition, a definition that can be applied, a definition that really makes sense when it comes to free speech, it's still wrong. And conservatives, mainstream conservatives I'm seeing on Twitter, they get this wrong so often, and it's crazy. And they'll come out and be like, man, this is a violation of free speech. Or this like, you have a right to free speech. These people that ban you don't care about free speech. That's not what this is. Again, if we operate from a logical definition of free speech, and let's say that it means, okay, the government can't punish you for something that you say. So people talk about press and what have you. Free speech, again, extended to the logical conclusion. Does Mark Zuckerberg have the right to start yelling in your house? And you can't kick him out because he can fall back on free speech? No. Or your building that you're on or your place of business? No. Nobody can just walk in there. You have the right to kick them out. That's your property. You have rules set. If I own a movie theater and I say no talking, no yelling, let's say, being disruptive, or you risk getting kicked out, that is my right. You can't fall back on, well, it's my free speech. It's my right to free speech to sit here and yell all the damn time in this movie theater. No, you don't have that right. That right does not exist. So I get the frustration. And I will even say that some of the people that they ban are even moderate in a sense. Like, there's far worse people to ban. Nonetheless, if you have an issue with this, I would highly advise that you don't look at it from the approach of this phantom free speech. You're shooting yourself in the foot, and they will absolutely use it against you, because there's been times where even conservatives have called, certainly in the past, called for this quote unquote censorship. And even when we talk about like the right to discrimination, private property rights, conservatives if we're comparing them to mainstream leftists like Democrats, then, well, they tend to be a lot more responsive to those concepts of private property rights, capitalism, and so forth. If you understand those concepts, then you know that you as a property owner can do what you want with it, so as long as you're not aggressing upon peaceful individuals. This is not an act of aggression that they're kicking you off of their platforms. That doesn't mean that and this is where the left gets it wrong, because they're like, when something like this happens, they're like, well, that's their right to do that. Understandable. That doesn't mean that you have to agree with it. It seems like these sides don't understand what private property rights are. I can complain about it just as much as, you can kick me off. I can complain. That's the whole thing, right? We talk about markets and whatnot. That feedback element is very important to even self-regulating or regulating a market regulation, a form of market regulation. Yelp is a form of market regulation where you get to complain or give a positive review about something, and people get to look at that and say, well, do I really want to do business with this person? Do I want to do business with this business? So look at it from that element. Look at it from that side. And when you take a step back and you look at it like that, you can really figure out what it is you need to attack if you have legitimate problem with this. Now, it does seem that some of these websites, massive corporations and websites, are working together sometimes. It seemed like the Alex Jones things, for example, was just a massive, like, all right, we're all doing this near the same time. We're getting them off of everything. This is an opportunity for other websites to fill that gap. It's not that they are destroying your free speech. They can't do that because it doesn't exist, number one. But that's not what they're doing. So I'd highly advise that instead of focusing on that, you should focus on alternatives. And I know there's alternatives that have popped up over the last couple of years to try to combat Facebook, to try to combat Twitter, saying they'll be a little more loose. Those are good things. I think there's a frustration because these guys have the precedent. Facebooks of the world have the precedent. Twitter of the world have the precedent because they are the first of its kind. And a lot of people are on them. They have a lot of users. So what people see is the frustration because those aren't catching on like them. They're not going to be as massive as those other platforms. So people are looking at that and they're saying, well, it's a violation. It's like, no. That's not the fault of Facebook or Twitter. Again, we're going to discuss some of this a little more here in a bit, but that's not the fault of them. That's the work of the market. People are unfortunately maybe deciding to use these other gigantic websites that are banning you. They're using those more so than the others. And yours hasn't caught on. Your alternative has not caught on. That doesn't mean that it won't. MySpace used to be on top of the world. Remember that. So there are alternatives that are popping up. But your frustration in that they're not catching on, I guess, as fast as you want them, does not justify. And I've seen conservatives go as far as to justify government regulation of these sites, which is insane. It just goes to show that if they can use the government in a way that benefits them, they absolutely will, which contradicts every positive thing that they have to say about or acting like they're advocate of capitalism, stuff like that. Again, you can be frustrated. You can voice your opinion on your own platforms and so forth. And I'd encourage you to do that. Push back. You don't have to just bend over and take it. Push back. Push back. But stop misspeaking and talking about this is a violation of rights because you are frustrated that this. And again, rightfully, I've been banned, dude. I've been banned on these sites as well. I've been not necessarily perma-banned like these guys have been taken down, but I've caught my 30-day bans, week bans, 24-hour bans. I've caught those. So I get it. And I don't like it. This is the whole reason why I started my own website. Because I just don't think it's smart to put all your followership into one platform. I think that's silly. So, because at any given time, they can take you down. They can take you down, man. They can take you down. So, take that into consideration. This false sort of fraud concept of free speech. I get the sentiment, but you're contradicting yourself. This is more specifically to the guys on the opposite side. And the side of, let's say, the conservative side, the mainstream conservative side, leftists get it wrong as well, and they contradict themselves because any other time it's bake the cake, right? Bake the cake, no discrimination. And then we get this form of discrimination. And now they're like, well, wait a minute, that's their right to do. See, come on, man. Make up your mind. This is why I say people should quit shying away, because people look at discrimination and they only apply it to like civil rights, pre-civil rights era, and they look at it like discrimination is not a negative thing per se. Everybody has the right to discriminate. It's a good thing that you have the right to discriminate. If you didn't have the right to discriminate, then, I mean, anybody could do whatever they wanted. Walk into your business, take a crap, whatever they wanted to do. You have the right to say no. Everybody discriminates. Anybody that says they don't discriminate is an active liar. Everybody discriminates. You discriminate with your partner. If you're in a monogamous relationship, you discriminate in the sense that I chose him or her over everybody else. It's discrimination by literal definition. There's some forms of discrimination, or the reasoning behind that discrimination may be, you may have an issue with it, and that's fine, like we have in this case. But that's their right to do it. Just like it's your right to complain, that's their right to do it, because it ultimately is their property. Now, what you should be, if you want to be effective in combating this, not only should you be looking to the alternatives, but there are barriers set in place. And this, for whatever reason, people don't focus on enough, but there are barriers set in place. And these barriers are not barriers by way of just, like, I'm not talking about markets, right? I'm talking about the barriers, the illegitimate barriers, and I'm talking about the barriers by way of the government. It's not just in this avenue. This seems to go completely untouched. And maybe it's because it forces people to not only extend their positions to the logical conclusion, but I think that the government that they worship and treat as if it's a god has to come under fire. But the barriers that I'm speaking on is how these gigantic media sites, corporations, are able to stay where they're at, largely due to regulation, business regulations, but also in the form of how, like that preferential treatment by way of the state, be it through grants, whatever promotion, like all of that stuff. And it's funny because it'd be the main sides that's talking about, well, corporations bad. And the corporations that they're backing tend to be using the government to stifle the competition, knock down the competition, make it hard for them to enter. That's what you should be focused on. Go look up what grants are the government giving Facebook, if any. What about Twitter? What about all of those things? What grants, what preferential treatment, are there any laws that allow them to combat competition? Does it prevent the market an alternative for propping up? Does it eliminate them? Does it keep them way below them? Does it help them in any way, shape, or form? That's what you need to be focusing on. And then at that point, it's not about free speech per se. It's just about, well, consistency. The government should not be involved in this. The government has artificially propped up this entity. The answer isn't to regulate. It makes me sick when I hear these people say this. Talking about regulation. Oh, we need more regulation. Because of how big it is, now we need to regulate. No, that is not the answer. That got you in the... Look, man, that's what causes a lot of the problems. The regulation from the get-go. The answer to government regulation isn't more government regulation. And the fact that there's conservatives out there that are advocates of this just goes to show that they don't know what the hell they're talking about. And really, they have a lot more common with mainstream leftists than they like to give themselves credit for. Because that is an anti-liberty position. Get the regulations, get those laws, the barriers of entry that prevent free people from coming up with these alternatives and existing. And it's not just with this, again, with the social media sites themselves, whether we talk about forms of payment, all of that stuff. Get the state out of the way. That's always the answer. And obviously, you still have to come up with some better alternatives that catches on with the people. But look at how the state is helping these websites exist. Focus on that. Not this phantom free speech. And certainly the answer isn't for more regulation. Just because, well, there's this favor here. They're taking money from the state, maybe. In some of these sites cases, that's exactly what they're doing. Taking money from the state. And then they have this sort of discriminatory policy. The answer is not, all right, well, regulate them. No. The answer is, okay, let's take the money away because the money's not yours to begin with. The state should stop robbing people first and foremost. But let's get rid of those elements and the laws that are surrounded around those barriers of entry that are preventing people from coming up with legitimate alternatives. Get them the hell out of the way. Free up the market. It's always the answer. As cliche as it sounds, it's always the answer. But you're creating more problem by wanting to give the state more power to regulate these because, like it always does, it comes back to haunt you. And that's why the government power doesn't shrink, because people keep making exceptions. They keep making exceptions. You got to stop that. I'd highly advise, if you are looking at some of these individuals that have been banned from these sites, these massive media sites that everybody utilizes, I would highly advise that you look into how the government helps them. And the answer is not and nor will it ever be to just throw some more regulation on it. All you are doing is you're just kicking a can down the road, but you are legitimizing the state. You are legitimizing the government's power, which will ultimately be used against you at some point. Just get them out the way. This is the perfect time to do it. Right now, people are irate. People are upset. This is the perfect time to highlight that. Say, hey, get the hell out of the way. Stop artificially propping up these institutions. Then let the markets decide. That doesn't mean that Facebook will fail. It doesn't. In the event that happens, that does not mean that Facebook will fail. I believe that they'll have to adjust their policies. But that in itself is a win, is it not? Or maybe an alternative does come and it sort of eclipses. All I'm saying is that the answer is not for falling back on phantom right to free speech, which doesn't exist when you look at it from other elements. The actual element of more so private property rights, the only rights that exist. It doesn't make sense. Just get to focusing on how the government artificially props up these businesses and then let the markets figure it out. Let the entities compete. We need more competition, not less competition. That's all I wanted to say on this topic matter. This was fun. I've discussed this before. So if you do want to check those videos out over at the YouTube, you can check them out. I've talked about free speech in depth. This is probably the most deep I've gone into this. But for sure, I've discussed it before. And I think it freaks a lot of people out. It freaks a lot of people out when you get to talking that, because it shatters their narrative, or it shatters what they've been led to believe. The God that is their little constitution, the God that is their catchphrases, right? And the government documents, the status documents. But I'm not saying this for shock value or anything like that. I'm saying think about the concept of free speech. Where does it exist? And then you're like, well, I never thought of it that way. Because I know I didn't until I heard guys like Rothbard talking about it. Like, well, wait a minute, that makes sense. So why are we championing something that doesn't really legitimately exist? Only private property rights exist. And again, if we're talking about using a term in terms of government doesn't have the right to discriminate against you or punish you for the way of your speech, that's not what we're talking about here. When we discuss these massive corporations, corporate entities that utilize the state to keep them in their position, and then in doing that, they have sort of discriminatory application of policy. So to wrap that up, screw the free speech stuff, focus on what the government is doing. Then let the markets compete. I also would say that if there's an element or aspect that you want to focus on that's probably going untouched, it's those terms of services. Those are contracts. So if you feel like they're not following the contract, attack that. But stop making things up. That's going to just about wrap it up for episode 2 of For Canon's Sake. This was a fun show. It's always a fun show. It's only the second show, but it's still always a fun show. It will forever be a fun show. I'm just upset that I didn't think to do this earlier. Peace, love, and liberty.
That's going to do it for today's episode of For Canon's Sake with Eric July. Be sure to keep it locked for the best mix of comics and political commentary you'll ever hear. And I mean ever hear. To get caught up or to contact the show, be sure to visit forcanonsake.com.